Welcome to this session of the You've Won Now What Advance Academy. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christy Burton Brown, Executive Vice President here at Advance Colorado and a member of the State Board of Education. Today, I'm joined by a special guest, Nancy Rumfelt, who is on the Thompson School District.
Yes.
She's also an accountant in her spare time. Long-time history dealing with numbers, which I think is an amazing skill to have when we have to deal with so many numbers, finances, budgetary questions on school board. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and one of Nancy's specialties is that she is actually a minority member on her school board. It might not seem like a specialty. I don't think most of us want to be in the minority, but a lot of us are in Colorado. A lot of good conservatives who've gotten elected to school boards find themselves in the minority. Sometimes, in fact, they're the only conservative on the school board. It can be discouraging to find what you actually can accomplish, what influence you can have, what difference you can make when you're in the minority. And so that's why we brought Nancy on, because she has amazing tips, information, and real solutions for minority members. So Nancy, I'd love you just to share a little bit of your story, why you're on the board, how you got there.
Well, I began working to try to reform education back in 2010. And so in Thompson School District, my husband and I are well-known people who attend all the meetings and try to make a difference. We actually defeated one of the mill levy overrides. It was a huge blank check, and we defeated it. And as time went on, I realized that the only way to try to affect real change was to finally get on the inside and run for school board. And I did that in 2021, right? COVID's going on and masks and everything. And I won. At first I was shocked. I was also then like, oh my gosh, no one else won with me. Now what? Now what do I do? And so it was an adjustment at first, just trying to figure out going from activist to now I'm actually elected official, yeah. Sitting up there at the dais like, oh, I have to have some decorum. I have to think about things. And they're all wanting me to fail. All the union, everyone's wanting me to fail. They're waiting for me to just make that crucial mistake that they can then just burn me at the stake for. And so it takes time. But then I realized, even though I'm in the minority, that I speak for a lot of people, parents, grandparents, students, and that's really who I'm speaking to every time there's a board meeting. I'm not speaking to my fellow board members. They have zero interest in hearing what I have to say, and they make that clear. I'm speaking to those people who have no voice, and that helps them feel like they're heard, they matter, somebody's in there, and you can make a difference. It does come slow. You do have to have thick skin, and you just have to keep persevering. And you only have two choices when you're in the minority. You either go along to get along, and so then you're totally ineffective, or you decide to accept the gift that God gave you, and you become the tip of the spear to pave the way for the next election.
I think that's such great advice. And especially when you said you have to know that you're not speaking to your fellow board members or for their approval, and instead you're speaking for all those people who feel like they don't have a voice, but you are that voice. It reminds me of advice I got when I used to deal with the media originally. I was told, you're never actually speaking to the reporter who's asking you a question. You're speaking to the audience. You're trying to convince, in that case, you're trying to convince voters. You're trying to help them out, not the reporter. It doesn't really matter if you convince them. So I think it's a really similar scenario where really understanding who you're speaking to can make a big difference in what you're willing to do and what you focus on.
Right. And it's also to that point when you are in the minority, it's really easy to feel like you're all alone. So there have, and I'm not going to lie, there's been some meetings. Serving on a school board at times is almost like a really awful version of Mean Girls, the movie.
I can see that, yeah.
You have to learn how to get some really thick skin. And so there's been some meetings where I've just left. You get in your car and you're like, why am I doing this to myself? But then that's where it's so important that you have to find your tribe. You have to find those people that are in the audience for you, even if it's just one person. My husband is always in the audience. The times that he's not, those are the times, you just still, I know he's watching or he'll be listening, but it's really important to have, even if it's only 3 people, that you can call later, or that they'll come to the meeting and sit, or maybe you can get them to speak, because and they want you to feel like you're alone. They want you to believe that you have no power. And so it's really important to always just take a deep breath and know that you got this. You can do it.
Well, and finding that tribe, I think, is so important if you could do it even while you're running for the campaign, because I do think we find that a lot of conservatives can get a lot of grassroots volunteers to go work for them, to knock doors, to do all these things to get them elected. But then once they're elected, they're like, oh, you're fine. Now you get to speak for us on the board. And so I think, I would assume, communicating to some of those people, at least a handful of them, that no, I need you with me through this whole process. Like, if we're going to be a voice for other parents who we know believe the way we believe, it can't just be me sitting there on the board. You do need those tribe people with you in the crowd, online, speaking.
And you absolutely, so of the people that ran with me in 23 that were not able to win their election, one of them, and everything happens for a reason. So I think Yasmin did not win because God said, well, this is her prep to take her where I really want her, which was the state board of education. And then you also have someone like Ryan who ran with me, but he's a vice chair on DAC, the District Accountability Committee. And so he very much has a voice still in the district, working with all those parents and trying to direct that committee to actually be parent-driven, focused, not district. And you just keep finding ways to get all of those other volunteers on different committees, because that's really where the meat of everything happens. What's going on at the dais, a lot of it's already been decided by the time it gets there. So having them in the committees so they can hear things, they can raise awareness to other issues that parents might not know, that is really powerful in itself. And so that's a great way to keep them involved and keep them going for when that seat will be up again. And so you just keep working at it.
Well, and I'd love if you could dive a little deeper there too, Nancy. Would you talk about like rallying and informing the community? You just mentioned committees that people can apply for, get on. What are some other, whether you want to talk about additional committees that are available to people, or just other ways you'd suggest our minority members can really inform the community about what's going on and how they could get involved?
Absolutely. So what I have found since being on the board is most parents, they're not speaking or coming before the board because they don't care. They honestly don't know what's happening.
Right.
And so the best thing you can do as a school board member is to inform them. So I maintained all of the emails from my campaigns, and I have a newsletter. I do it via MailChimp. It's like $13 a month, and keeps them informed of, here's some of the things coming up on our agendas. Here's some of these issues you should be aware of. This is where it might be good for you to come to the board and speak or send emails or any of those things. Or here's here's our DAT committee, here's when it's meeting. And I also promote other events within the community as well. But that's a really good way to do is with the newsletter. There's also Facebook. I kept my campaign Facebook page.
Okay.
I will tell you, the first 2 years I was on the school board, they wasted so much time trying to get me to shut it down.
Wow.
And I just kept saying, I'm elected. That doesn't mean my First Amendment went away.
Well, right.
And so when you do things like that, though, you always have to make sure you have your disclaimer. I do not speak for or on behalf of the board. These are my personal statements and opinions. It's just, you just always say that. But the Facebook page is a great way also to engage with your community and find your local community pages within your district.
Okay.
And then post things onto that page, because then you'll get a lot more parents. They'll be like, I didn't know that, or hey, did you know this? And so then you can advocate for parents and students via that way. And you can also do town halls. I do town halls. I do them virtually. Sometimes I do them in person. And the other school board members could do this. but they don't. But it's allowed a lot more parents and people in the community to be aware of what's really going on, and to know that somebody is actually fighting for them. And that is very important.
Yes, well, and it seems to me like positioning yourself as the voice of parents is very, very powerful, because I would assume even some parents who may not 100% agree with you appreciate just your engagement in the community. Because I agree, a lot of school board members, when they're in the majority, tend to just say, oh, we'll show up at the meetings and like we get to make the rulings and our side wins.
Right.
And so they lose that motivation, I think, sometimes to really engage person by person with parents who have something to say. And to your point, really also want to find committees to get involved in or other work they can do to be engaged in their children's school.
Absolutely. I've even had some parents approach me that say, there are a lot of things I don't agree with you on politically, but on the stuff that you're doing here at the school board or on this issue,
right.
I'm 100% with you.
Yes.
And so that goes back to also, when you're serving in the minority, don't sit up there and become a bomb thrower, because that accomplishes nothing. And that's what actually they expect you to do.
They do, yes.
They do. So sit up there with a smile on your face, be polite to your other board members, treat them with respect, ignore their eye rolling and their hand waving and their laughing and all the other things that they'll do to you. But have the decorum, have the respect for the office that you were elected to. And that, in the end, is what wins people over, even those that don't agree with you on everything. But when they see you hold yourself to a higher standard, then you do gain their respect. And that goes a long ways with the community. And they just start to trust you. And I think that's very important.
Building trust is so important. I couldn't agree more. One other thing, Nancy, I'd love you to dive into a little deeper. You mentioned, for example, on the Facebook page that knowing your rights is really important. If you're an elected official, you still have a First Amendment right to speak. As long as you put the right disclaimers on there and aren't representing the entire board, you can represent yourself. I've seen a great paper you've written that I think we're going to share with everyone watching this video, that gives some of your recommendations, but you talk about really understanding the statutes and laws that apply to school board members. And I think you've mentioned there's one in particular that's really, really important to understanding your rights. Can you explain that?
Sure. So one of the things is when you're elected to the school board, you have access per law to all records. You can request any records you want at any time. And it's in statute 2232-1032. Memorize it, because they will try to tell you can't have that information. And so my school district no longer tries to tell me that, because I've made it clear in my ever so gentle way that you can't deny me this information. Now, sometimes they might, depending on what's contained in it, they might ask you to come to the administrative building and read it there. That's fine. Sure. You still have access to that information. But information is what is your superpower. When they're doing the budget, when they're getting ready to do some new proposal, or there's something going on in the district, ask for all of the information. So now you have all of the facts, and then you can share them out. That's really what they don't want. They don't want the community to have all the information and to have all the facts. They want to control everything, and they can't when someone like myself is in there saying, well, no, actually, here's the truth about the budget, or here's the truth about this.
That's so true. And I think you mentioned some other statutes, one on budget contents.
Right.
What is that?
There's another statute that actually says what has to be in, and it's 2244-105, and actually the whole 22-44 is all about the financial requirements. And so there are certain things, and I have been saying to our own district since I've been on, we're not complying with this statute. And only recently they're now listening to me because we failed our audit.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But that's really important. And so this helps people understand what's actually going on with the budget and where their money's being spent, because they really don't want you to know where your money's being spent. They just want you to keep giving it to them, okay?
Exactly.
Open up your checkbook. Yes. Give me your money now, all of it.
Typical government.
It's for the kids.
Yes.
And then there's also things like at a special meeting, when you're at a special meeting, meaning it's been called for a specific special purpose, that agenda cannot be changed unless all board members are present and it's unanimous. And there is a statute about that, and I believe you have it. It'll be in that document that you're going to share out. But that's really important, so that then they can't play games when they call a special meeting. And there's just so many little things like that, like even on the library books. I know, like right now there's legislation. And I don't know how they're going to deal with it in this bill, because there's an actual statute that says, by law, school boards, we're supposed to make sure that all books in libraries and in the classrooms are not immoral. They're not immoral of nature or pernicious. So we do have a say in what books go in schools. And so we do have the ability to say, look, we don't need to have books for first graders that are going into detail about sexuality. That's not appropriate. You know, or some of these other books, even at the middle school level and the high school level, that we've all seen and heard about. But that statute, if they don't deal with this in that new legislation, I think that whole legislation is just, it's moot. Without addressing this statute for school board members, they're in conflict, which I'm sure they don't pay attention to. But
no, it's an interesting point, and I think your overarching point that our minority members and really every member of a school board should be paying attention to what the law actually says, both to understand your own rights and what you can speak up for, what you can ask for, and what you can demand in a nice way, like you said, but also what rights you have to speak up on behalf of parents and the constraints that they might want to put on a school board that the school board really has to be following according to law, which can so easily be ignored. So I think that's a really great point to focus our people on, is understanding the laws. What would you say, Nancy, about understanding Robert's Rules of Order or making motions as a minority member, especially if you maybe know they're not going to pass? What would be your recommendation?
Making motions is a great way to get something in a public record.
Okay.
And so when you make a motion under Robert's Rules, if you don't receive a second, your motion dies. And so there'll be no discussion or vote on it. Many times I've made motions and I know I'm not going to receive a second. I make the motion, and I try to make the motion have as much detail as possible so that it gets read into the record. And now it's public record that my fellow board members couldn't even have the respect to give me a second so we could have a real discussion about it. And it can be on things ranging from the budget to policies dealing with discipline, to gender, the new gender ideology, parental consent, parental notification. It is a great tool to use. And if you do happen to get a second, then also be ready with really clear talking points of why you think that motion is so important. And then it also goes on record that they all voted no against it. So it's a very powerful tool to use, just as is your vote of no. Don't be afraid to vote no. I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid. I have voted no on 2 of the 3 budgets since I've been a school board member.
Yeah.
And so, again, that becomes an opportunity to say why you're voting no. And then it goes into public record while they all vote yes on it. And so it becomes very clear who's trying to protect the taxpayer and make sure the money goes into the classroom and not many of the other pet projects that they like to have.
Right. Well, it seems like the audit vindicated you in this last vote too.
It did very much. Yeah. I hate talking about the audit.
Right. I can understand why. Well, Nancy, I think I have 2 more things that I'd love to ask you about, and then I'll definitely give you the last word, whatever message you'd like to leave our minority school board members with. But consent agendas, how would you recommend board members handle those?
Again, consent agendas are another opportunity to put things into the public record. So consent agenda are those items that on paper you have discussed as a board and everything's good. There's nothing outrageous in it. There's no objection. It's not something that's going to be contentious. You've discussed it. Now it's just going to go on the consent agenda with a bunch of other items, and you just vote it You vote it through all at once.
Mm-hmm.
But you can pull anything off of the consent agenda.
Right.
They'd actually become so used to me doing it that at the last meeting for the consent agenda, where it was time for the board president to say, is there anything that anyone would like removed from the consent agenda? I didn't say I didn't have anything. And the board president, she said, you don't have anything? I said, no, not this time.
No. Yeah.
But you can pull it off,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't need a motion for it. You don't need a second. You just pull it off, and then now you have the floor to explain why you wanted it pulled off of the consent agenda and why you want it to have a separate vote. And so that again is very powerful, because now you've pulled something off and you make them vote on it individually. And that's what I did with we have a bunch of what they call the AC policies and all the exhibits that go with it that involved parental consent, which was absent.
Okay.
And so there were 4 of those policies that we were revising, but again, without adding parental consent. So I pulled all 4 of them off, and they had listed all 4 as separate items. So I got to go through 4 times and pull it off and speak to why it should not be voted on and it should have been pulled off, because parental consent was once again not included for notifying parents that their child wanted a gender transition plan. And so in the end, they of course passed, but they had to vote on each one of those individually and say yes, they supported something without parental consent.
Yeah, well, I think to your point, drawing attention to issues like that, I know that we have some members who are the minority on school district boards, even in conservative districts, where if the parents were aware that some of these issues were going on and sort of hidden into consent agendas, they would actually be very, very concerned. So I think while we often think of our minority members as being in more liberal districts, that's actually not even always true, because a lot of times there aren't people like you who've been willing to run for boards, even in conservative areas. So I think your point about exposing what's really going on, mm-hmm. so that if parents want to know, and when you reach out to them and inform them and engage them, they can be aware of why it might be necessary for one of them to run for the board next time, or get involved in a further way.
Right, and even, this is where sometimes little things go a long ways. Mm-hmm. The first time I pulled something off the consent agenda, the board president was so angry and taken by surprise. And so what I learned is, now I always give her advance notice. So she knows. And you know what? Even though she still doesn't like me and still isn't, she appreciates that I now give her that notice, and she's aware.
That's a kind thing.
It goes a long way.
Absolutely.
So.
No, that's a great point. I like that. My last question for you, Nancy, is how would you use or recommend that our members use their board report time, which I believe every member has at every meeting, to give a report?
Right. So every school district is different, but most of them have an opportunity where during the regular meeting, board members can give a report. Most of them will talk about their committees, which quite honestly, the community doesn't care about the committees you're on. I mean, they really don't. And so that's an opportunity for you to speak to some issue that you think is really important, that you want to draw attention to. I try to keep mine to 2.5 minutes. I know that once I start approaching 2.5 minutes, I'm about to get the, so, yes. And the board president, again, she'll always tell everybody what she'd like them to speak about on their board report. And she, again, has become accustomed to, sometimes I will honor her request. Most of the time, I just speak about whatever I wish. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they can be very controversial, and sometimes it can be pointed, but I always keep it respectful. But it's a good way to let people know you hear them, you see them, and you're not letting these important issues go when you're in there fighting for them. So it's another very powerful tool that a minority board member has.
And Nancy, as we wrap this up, is there any last word you'd like to leave our school board members with?
Just remember, you're stronger than you think. God chose you for a reason, and you can do this. And while you're doing it, have fun, laugh. Just have fun. Just laugh at some of the absurdities that they will throw, that they will do at you. And never forget that you were there for a reason, speaking for all those parents and their children, and you have a powerful voice that is needed. Never forget that.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us at this session with Nancy Rumfelt from the Thompson School Board District. I'm Christy Burton Brown from Advanced Colorado. We appreciate your time and hope you've been encouraged and informed by this session.